profiles of well-known people in their last hours and in the last how they managed. At the same time, there have been more and more books about aging and the aging process. I'm thinking about Being Mortal, which was hugely popular, at least in the States. Very recently, John Leland in the New York Times tracked, I think 9 old folks for over a year and a half. It was a wonderful, in-depth portrait of those people, which has resulted in a new book called Happiness is a Choice You Make. And he talks, what's moving about his work is he talks a lot about how changed he was in the year and a half of working with these old folks. What struck me as I got older was the absence of anyone talking about the period between, say, 60 and 80, depending on what sociologists you read, which is identified as a period when we are young old. This is the period, the space between middle age, when we may be swamped with raising families, making careers, some of us trying to change the world, and when we're old, and when we may be fragile and in need of lots of supports, or maybe choosing to withdraw from the world a bit. But here's this big space, and no one's talking about it really. I was sorry to have missed, by the way, the presentation done here called Retirement and Its Discontents. I was really sorry to miss that because I thought that would be right up my alley. In short, I wasn't seeing models that spoke to my experience. So there is this traditional model of aging, and you become wiser, you become gentler, and you dispense wisdom. That's sort of one traditional model of aging. And then there's another more contemporary model of aging, which is you get old, you get fragile, you are in need of lots of help and lots of support, you can't manage on your own, and you are a non-productive member of society. None of this seemed to work for me. None of it seemed to work for the increasing number of baby boomers, 76 million in North America, who want to remain active, engaged, and fully participatory. What I also saw on a more personal note among my friends was a feeling that they were totally unprepared. Like when retirement hit, and retirement's a word I don't actually use in my own vocabulary very much, they thought they were in totally new territory, had never experienced this before, were unprepared for it. And for me, when I'm faced with a challenge, the first thing I do is I grab my early childhood hat. So early childhood is where I found my disciplinary home for all of my professional life. It's a place where I've come to think about human development, and where I've come to think about how people change over time, and also a place where I've come to think a lot about how people really don't change over time, how they continue to meet a series of challenges that are lifelong challenges, and that's not bad. Nothing gets resolved. We keep working at this stuff. So in that disciplinary home, I have found myself in this position of being rather obsessed about our natality, as Hannah Arendt, those of you who know Hannah Arendt's work will know, she talks about our natality and our mortality. So we're talking about the early years and we're talking about the end point of life. So I'm concerned with both ends of the spectrum, and that's what my work has been about. To be clear, here in the School of Social Work and in this Center of Life Course Development, I'm not a gerontologist. I'm not a social worker. I am not even a sociologist. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to come here, because I thought I can learn from you all. There must be some of you all in those disciplines, and they're certainly not they're not my bailiwick. So I look forward to conversation. I thought I should begin a little bit talking about my background and what this early childhood had is about and what it's taught me. I began as a nursery school teacher in the 1960s when they were called nursery schools still. And from the moment that I entered the nursery school classroom, the thing that struck me was that the questions that the children were asking, either literally or through their play, were the same questions that I was asking as a young adult. So these children were asking, can I survive in this classroom on my own without a caregiver? Am I able to make my way? What is my social identity going to be? And certainly as a young adult, living in my own apartment, supporting myself for the first time, I was also asking, can I make it on my own without my family? What is that going to be about? So the kids were asking questions at their level, but they certainly were provoking me. It was a place for me to think about my own life, even as I was trying to care for them. In the same way, as a gay man, a concern for me in the late 60s and 70s was the whole realm of family. What is a family? What's a family of choice? What's a family of birth? And so on. And young children, as you may know, are the most fantastic theoreticians of family. So children are playing, there are 2 dads, there are 3 moms, and this is 1960s. There are, no children in this family, and there are half a dozen children in that family. And they are trying to put together and make sense of what does it mean to be a family. So literally in the year of Stonewall, I was in this classroom trying to figure out and participating in Stonewall, having come out prior to Stonewall, trying to understand what's my relationship to my family of birth, how can I create a family for myself, and here are the kids playing the same stuff out. So this is, fantastic. And what strikes me and stayed with me my entire professional life is that if teachers can understand the richness of this life, it will be forever a source for them to continue growing and thinking and reflecting on making meaning for themselves. And increasingly, of course, we're stuck with standards, we're stuck with academic programs in which kids are less and less able to have space to play and to think about these issues, which is to me devastating. And I think ultimately we'll lose all our good teachers because there'll be nothing of interest for them. There'll be nothing stimulating, nothing provocative. But anyway, so I would say from the beginning, I saw connections between myself and the kids and the questions, the basic questions about life and meaning. When I began doctoral work 10 years later, having left the classroom, I thought temporarily, I developed a rather extensive and one of the early critiques of the child development literature, of notion of stages, the notion of a linearity in how we grow and develop. I was concerned on several fronts, and I'm speaking about a kind of a structural issue, whether it was Piaget or whether it was Freud, Erikson, who was the most robust, I thought, Kohlberg's moral development, all of these stages had the impact of separating children and adults in a separate world. Children weren't. They weren't yet knowledgeable enough. They weren't yet developed enough. Their cognitive thinking wasn't yet sophisticated enough. So children were seen in terms of their absences, and adults were then on the other side of it. We are the ones who have come through this linear path, and we are wise, and we are knowledgeable, and so on. And I felt that position both children and adults in the wrong way, and led to a kind of othering. Children were other because they weren't all these things adults were, and that concerned me. I was concerned about the bias in the research at that point. Most of these linear developmental models were based on white male children. And so you may remember way back when people, for example, like Carol Gilligan came along and said, the particular model of moral development, this doesn't work for women. This isn't the way women's lives are like. And this pattern that you've described doesn't fit the experience of women. And in the 90s, you had queer theorists coming along and saying, this notion of linearity doesn't also fit queer lives, which are far messier and which aren't about a linear progression to maturity and bearing children and all of the kind of reproductive assumptions that were built in traditional models. So I was concerned about that kind of bias in the developmental models. I know this is kind of like very general, but the other thing, from a Foucauldian point of view, what also concerned me was that these models of development, the way the models of development functioned in the lives of teachers. So it's not so much what they said specifically, but how did they function? And the way that they functioned was twofold. One is they functioned to say, I don't have to talk to children about X, Y, and Z because they're not ready. They can't possibly understand what death, because, well, Piaget said they have no sense of finality. That's not going to come till they're 7 or 8, so you can't talk to a younger child about death. Children are too vulnerable. Freud would say they're too psychologically fragile. So you had the theories tended to function to keep adults silent about what I consider to be critical issues that should be being talked about with kids and that kids could grasp. And so that was another reason why I began to look at, well, what's going on here in these models, which all tended in the end in the educational realm to be used to support increasingly academic and cognitive programs, and devalued other ways of knowing. They devalued the arts, they devalued the non-rational ways of knowing because those were somehow, in quotes, more primitive. And as we move forward, we want to celebrate cognition in traditional senses. Of course, no one wanted to hire me, right? Because I mean, what I heard through the scuttlebutt was when I finished my PhD, of course, he's not going to teach Piaget. We can't hire him. His ideas are very interesting, but he's not going to teach these seminal thinkers, so we can't have him on faculty. There was a lot of blowback that way. And it was hard for me to get a real job. At the same time, it was the early 80s, and I was a New Yorker, and hit early and hard by the AIDS crisis in New York as a gay man, and had the opportunity to be involved early on in AIDS work and to be paid for it, which I felt it was amazing. And I spent 10 years doing AIDS work, thinking I'd left early childhood behind, using my early childhood skills nonetheless, but I was in a new world. Again, two things struck me from my experiences in doing AIDS work that are relevant here in terms of my thinking about education and care. The first is that it certainly affirmed for me that kids need to hear and be talking about their real lives. And in New York, that certainly meant AIDS, that certainly meant substance abuse. And to turn a blind eye on that, to me, was ethically unacceptable, because this was what kids were living. And kids needed adults. Kids needed adults to help them separate out fact from fantasy, their imaginations, and to turn a blind eye on that seemed to me ethically and morally and unacceptable. The other thing, and I think this then played out in my life in complicated ways, was the realization that what was hard for teachers and adults in general was when faced with a question like AIDS or substance abuse, we as adults did not have an answer. We did not have a fix. We couldn't fix it for kids. And there is an impulse, or I hesitate to use the word instinct, there's an impulse. You want to make it better for kids. You want to be able to say it's going to be better. And oftentimes you can't. So what is it that you can do? And it seemed to me that what we're left with, and I think this applies not only to kids, what you're left with is the ability, the human ability, to bear witness to another's suffering. It doesn't fix it for another, but you can hear them out. You can confirm for them. And I think with children particularly, but it's true with adults, our role as educators is to provide the materials and the skills for telling your own story, and for telling your own story in a way that turns you from victim into agent. So it's this notion that storytelling becomes a form of agency. And I take as an example, most recently, what we see happening in the States, in Florida, and actually across the States, in terms of young people seizing this narrative around gun control and the violence to which they've witnessed, and seizing control of that narrative and saying, we're not victims here. We can be agents, and we can help, and we can try to change things. So it's that notion that listening to stories, helping kids, providing the tools for kids to tell stories, that's our role, not fixing the world. And I think that's also true to some extent in elder care, that part of what we do is we listen to other people's stories. We witness their lives, and we help them to tell their stories in a way that maybe helps them to rewrite their stories sometimes, to reimagine their stories. And again, for me, it's about this movement between what was, in quotes, my professional life and what was my personal life. How the skills that I learned in one arena played out in another arena. So working with people with AIDS made me stronger in my belief that that had to be part of the school curriculum, and yet working in the school made me aware of this business of bearing witness and helping people to tell their stories, which I could then bring into my experiences, not only with people with AIDS, but very much as it happened in the next decade with my parents. So when I left AIDS work and began back in teacher education, I also began a 10-year stint of caregiving for my parents, who went through a precipitous decline through their 80s and into their early 90s. But again, I brought this toolkit of early childhood skills with me. I knew how to set boundaries. I knew how to foster independence. I knew how to break down complicated tasks, and all things I had learned in early childhood classroom, but as my parents declined, were essential for being a caregiver with my parents. They really enabled me to do, I think, the best that I possibly could. And that was 10 years ago when I was here with the book, My Father's Keeper, the story of a gay son and his aging parents, when I talked specifically about that process of care. Now we're 10 years on, and the ground shifted. I'm 10, 15 years older. I can see the moment when I will be less of a caregiver and more of someone in need of care, and my generation will be. And so what I want to pose today is just three of the themes out of many, which I think are salient to me, but come out of my early childhood experience and perspective. And so I think that the first challenge, one of the main challenges that we face in this period of young old age, is the challenge of managing independence and dependence. Or Maggie Kuhn talked about our lifelong interdependence. I think, it's easy to see the question, the push-pull between the desire to stand on one's own and the need to rely on others in young children. It was easy to see it in my elderly parents, and some of you may have had that same experience. It's a little harder to capture that push-pull in young old folks. So here's a piece of narrative. My books always work by memoir and narrative. And so here's a short piece of narrative about that push-pull around independence and interdependence. Surgery, November 2012. Feeling pretty good about 70 was an achievement earned through emotional and physical hard work. I hadn't stinted on the effort, but the long-term payment, lessons in taking action, setting attainable goals, and staying in the moment felt worth the effort. Indeed, these are some of the same lessons I've needed to learn across a lifetime. 3 years before 70, however, preparing for my first cataract surgery, I was far more ambivalent about turning yet another page in the calendar. I wondered if I was moving too quickly, demanding a fix to a problem that cast only a small shadow over my daily life. After all, I was doing at 67 what my father and mother did at 86 and 90, respectively. I anxiously queried the ophthalmologist about this generational difference, about the possibility that we were acting too soon. My question about the timing came out askew. No, he answered, cataracts aren't more prevalent. We just see them earlier and earlier, and as they appear earlier, like most other things, they grow faster and bigger. Time to take care of them, sooner rather than later. I liked Dr. Mackenzie, but was confused by the vague sooner rather than later comment. Had he meant a few weeks, months, or years? And I found the allusion to most other things even more mysterious. What other things? The lack of decisiveness I read in Dr. Mackenzie's words were not unfamiliar. No rush, said the surgeon in 2003 when the steep New York City subway steps had become a painful ordeal and I was anticipating knee surgery. Come back when you can't stand the pain any longer. We'll take care of it then. These directions troubled me. I wanted to think that the time of surgery was a medical decision made by an expert in accord with a universally acknowledged scientific rubric. Instead, I learned that at least in some situations, it might be a subjective decision left up to the patient. When you can't stand the pain any longer. And when exactly would that be? Even with knees and hips, where it seemed that pain and limited mobility were obvious, judgment can be clouded. Okay, I finally announced to my partner David one morning in exasperation. It's time for the hip replacement you keep putting off. But I was fine yesterday, he said in a voice that was declarative and pleading at the same time. Yes, fine in the day, but the last 2 nights you've been screaming in pain. I woke up and did my best to wake you. Why did you do that? Why didn't you let me sleep? David was impatient, on the edge of angry. I cloaked my feelings in words of concern. I was worried, yes, scared. No need, he reassured me, I'll be okay. I changed tactics, abandoned the vocabulary of the distraught partner for the authority that comes with a clear-headed, objective appraisal of what lost sleep can be to productive life. After all, I was the bookmark, the placeholder, the page where it was written, now is the time. Vision was different. It deteriorated slowly, painlessly. Of course, there was the difficulty, eventually the impossibility of reading phone numbers or the credit card keypad in the grocery store. Most disconcertingly, your no longer lame and fully mobile partner, he who had gone forward with his own surgery, informed you that the beguiling cat you glimpsed on the front steps one evening was only a shadow cast by a rolled-up newspaper. Now he became the page where it was written. Reluctantly, I read the page, and in the morning, set the date. So, watching my parents struggle with aging, they tended to turn a blind eye on anything that needed to be done, anything invasive, and they put off their cataract surgeries, way towards the end. I understood cataract surgery differently. I began to understand it as a form of or way to sustain independence. So rather than being a sign of being more decrepit, I understood if I took action and had the surgery, I would be more independent and less dependent on David. So, every generation thinks they can do it better. I think that my generation thinks that by grabbing hold, that we will be able to take charge of life. Now, we all know that you can't really take charge of life. Life takes charge of you willy-nilly. And this may be our downfall. But we're acting as if I take charge, things will come out better. And that's certainly the way I felt about the cataract surgery. Because many of my friends, I was one of the first in my cohort, and many, why are you doing that? It's so early. And I said, I think I'll be better off for it. So there's that tension between dependence and independence. The second theme, which I think is a lifelong theme, is the question of loss and how we manage loss and how we recuperate or recover from loss. And if you take a psychoanalyst like Adam Phillips, who you may be familiar with, Adam Phillips says our entire life trajectory is about managing loss. From the moment we enter this world and lose some of that basic connectedness with our first caregivers, it's a story of loss and substitutions and displacements and the ways that we manage loss. And so that's always kind of fascinated me. On the cusp of young old age, just before I entered this period, I had a series of huge losses, including my life partner of 30 years at that point. Then my father died several months after my life partner. And then several months after that, my mother died. So it was, like that. Here's an excerpt from the book in which I talk about loss in a kind of the mundane way that it hits you. This is called Finding My Way, August 2010. Because of the years of AIDS care, because of the decade of my parents' illnesses, I thought I should have been better prepared to cope with his death, but I wasn't. Perhaps I should have understood that the death of a partner means not only the loss of an individual, but also the loss of a way of life. But I didn't. I was continually ambushed by surprising emotions. A friend who lived deep in the woods invited me to dinner, a gesture of kindness I accepted, pleased by the prospect of spending a quiet night with a caring companion. Getting into the car, I panicked. Bob was the navigator when we drove together. I have a terrible sense of direction. I turned on the light and carefully studied the map. I wrote out detailed directions in big print so they'd be able to read them while driving in the dark. My usual anxiety about losing my way was heightened with the emotional disorientation that accompanied Bob's death. Nothing to do, I told myself, but move cautiously forward, No precipitous turns, no improvisation, no deviation from the plan. When I arrived at my destination, I proudly announced that I made the trip without a single wrong turn. Jane didn't get it. I'd been there so often before. Explaining the nature of my success in greater detail, I was suddenly overcome by sadness. My newly activated internal compass came with a terrible price. I was glad to have it. I was sorrier than anyone will know to need it. Well, I had long theorized the way that learning might involve loss. I was viscerally experiencing the ambivalence and sadness that acquiring new skills can entail. I thought with compassion of a friend's 3-year-old who was finally being weaned and didn't want to give up the breast. She wanted to be, in quotes, a big girl, and yet wanted to hold on to a mother she adored. Neither did I want to relinquish a life that Bob and I had constructed together with its familiar habits of mind, body, and heart, even as I knew that without letting go, there would only be more and more pain. So my experiences of loss led me to think about the way that individual losses and the fear of individual loss worked in the classroom for some children. And I refer specifically to the way that learning often involves giving up older ways of knowing in the interests of acquiring new ways. And that teachers are often blind to what's entailed in the giving up of the old way of knowing. The old way of knowing has worked for us. And suddenly you're telling me I have to multiply in this new way. Why should I learn this new way? I'm happy with the old way. If you take it in a more fundamental way, think about a child learning to tie a shoelace. Learning to tie a shoelace makes you more independent. But it also means that you're not going to have that lovely adult bending over and that moment of intimacy when that adult is helping to tie your shoes and get you dressed. So there is a lot that you give up in this acquiring of new skills and new ways of being in the world. So we tend to, we glorify independence. You'll be more independent when you, tie your own shoes. Yes, but what is it that you may not have? So my beef through all this has been that what we need to be thinking about is how to increase children's repertoires of being in the world so that learning is understood as additive rather than subtractive. You don't replace old ways of knowing with new, you add them so that you can still get your shoelaces tied, you can still be read to at night, even though you can read perfectly well on your own. You don't have to give up the intimacy and the wonderful connection of being read to just because you can do it yourself. And I've wanted that in schools for people to recognize that. I think of this too. I mentioned earlier about how I saw the sort of the stage theories as pushing people more and more in sort of cognitive directions. But again, thinking about the ways that kids learn with their bodies. I didn't want that to end when they were 4 years old. I wanted body learning to continue all through our lives. I wanted the use of our bodies, the use of our aesthetic and other modes of apprehending the world. I wanted those supported. I didn't want to lose them in some notion that they were sort of more primitive. And again, so there's this kind of, this kind of synergy between what's happening to me in my own life and then how I'm thinking about these themes in a work world. Okay, one more big theme, and that seems to me I recognized in early childhood, but seems to me significant in terms of young adulthood, young old age, and that's what I call it: making our mark on the world. The kind of tension between wanting to be visible and sometimes wanting to be invisible in the world. So again, I'm thinking about when I first entered the classroom with kids, the way that kids enter the classroom. So kids enter the classroom, if you watch them, some enter in a big, bold way and really want their imprint on that environment instantly. Some enter more quietly. There's a zillion styles for entering the room. But in the end, over the life of the classroom, everyone wants to make their mark on that classroom in some fashion. And I'm thinking about that now because I think one of the things that's important in young old age is that we continue to want to make our mark on the world. And what does that look like? And particularly in a youth-oriented culture where you are discounted with the sign of the first gray hair, you're out. What does it mean to continue to make your mark on the world, to be participatory, to be recognized, and to be recognized as a contributing member? So this was a particular struggle for me personally, and certainly for me, quite a few years in my 60s, I really withdrew from my professional conversations. I thought, I've said everything I've had to say. It's no longer relevant. I remembered as a young academic going to educational conferences, sitting in the back row, seeing some old crony giving a paper and said, oh, she's talked about that for the last 30 years. This is ridiculous. And really being quite nasty. And I did not want to be that person who people were commenting on like that. So I began to withdraw. Then something happened, two things actually. I'm going to describe one of them here. Jen Gilbert, who is a colleague of mine, a younger colleague of mine, a younger generation, invited me to give a talk at York University, where she teaches at the School of Education. And I have to say, I obsessed endlessly about this talk, far more than I should have, but I did. And this little excerpt is about what that experience was like for me and what it did for me. It's called Emotional Relevance, February 2014. We arrived a few minutes late, and as we made our way down the side aisle of the modern amphitheater-style classroom, we were greeted by the familiar sounds of 80 students, well into the semester, talking about assignments due, classes missed, weekend plans. This lively chatter, a contrast to the more tense silence of the first sessions before friendships have blossomed, collaborative assignments initiated, and shared interest established, signaled a class of individuals that had become a vital group. Jen had told me that many of the students would be immigrants or the offspring of first-generation immigrants from Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Asia. I saw many heads covered in scarves and bodies enveloped in burqas and in saris. I was used to teaching in New York City with its own particular mix of students, but in this Toronto auditorium, I was compelled to ask myself how a hyper-educated 68-year-old white man from a middle-class background, rich in social, if not economic capital, could relate to youth from working-class and lower-middle-class non-European backgrounds, some only recently arrived in Canada. The question of relevance, which I had naively imagined primarily in terms of age, was now complicated by questions of race, class, and culture. Where would we find common ground, and how might our differences generate meaningful conversation? In the essay which the students had read in preparation for the class, one which I had written previously, I suggested that reading and writing have their roots in our first relationships with caregivers, in the desire to sustain connection even as we want to pull away and establish separate identities. I described how, for me, learning to read and write was entangled with a fraught nexus of emotions that bound me to my parents with my burgeoning sexuality. I also described how later in life, writing became a practice that helped me keep my head above water as the practical and psychological needs of caring for my rapidly deteriorating parents threatened to swamp my life. The students in Jen's class were thoughtful and undeniably engaged, both with my essay and its afterlife. I saw this in the way they made connections to other texts they had read, to movies they had seen, to their own struggles with learning. They questioned me about my life. What was it like to know you were gay in the 1950s? When did your parents become more accepting of your sexual orientation? They questioned me about the difficult ideas in the text about object relations theory and curriculum making, about psychodynamic readings of teacher-student relationships. Their questions suggested the power of personal narrative to give access to otherwise opaque theories, as well as to the emotional memories they may unleash within us. Looking back, I see that my initial preoccupation with relevance when Jen extended the invitation to speak was naive, if not egocentric. It failed to take into account my basic questions of class, race, and ethnicity. I can't know what the students were thinking, but their comments led me to imagine the ways that my experiences may have resonated with theirs. As offspring of recent immigrants faced with learning to read and write in a second language, I imagined that quite a few students might have identified with my own efforts to become a confident student. Encounters with teachers more or less skillful, pressures from families spoken and silent, responses from peers sympathetic and teasing. My stories of loss may well have resonated with losses, albeit of different kinds. Friends and family who live far away, familiar languages and ways of life not viable in Canada. The battles I depicted with my parents might also have echoed intergenerational strife for newly arrived families. Young people who needed to adapt to new contexts, watched by parents filled with ambivalence about assimilation and leaving the old behind. Nor had I anticipated the question of relevance might have been as salient for the students as for me. They too have been preoccupied with identifying their own places within the university and larger Canadian life. Although the stories I told that day in class reflected the particularities of my age, middle-class upbringing, and adult life, I need not have worried about their differences. For while the story must be compelling, it's the emotional themes grounding the narrative that create linkages and identifications for the student reader. The students taught me that it is the themes, loss and separation, recuperation and repair, identity and diffusion, that really matter, that make us relevant to others when they ring true. So this event was important for sort of turning around my sense of how I might have something to say, might share an experience with people who were just totally different from me in terms of age and background and so on, but that there could be a meaningful conversation that took place. And it turned out that age was not the issue at all. So like with all my preoccupation, am I too old to do this? It was really irrelevant. I'll say a second thing, and then I'm going to stop. I've been talking a long time. The kind of in the same year, I was invited to give a big talk in Australia, and again, I obsessed about not going because I thought I'm not relevant. And I went at the urging of my partner, cum life coach, and what happened in that talk was because I talked personally and used first-person narrative, it was incredibly compelling if I judge it by what happened afterwards, where so many people came up and made appointments to talk to me, to talk about the fact that they had stories they wanted to tell but were afraid to tell them, in part because they thought that it might damage their professional careers, that was not the way that you got tenure or moved ahead by talking in a very personal way in a scholarly setting. Now, I thought we had fought that battle in the 1980s and 90s, but apparently I was wrong, and that battle wasn't over. And it was clear that aside from the content of my talks, it was my willingness to be personal in those settings that grabbed so many of the people in the audience. So that was fascination. But again, it reminding me, maybe it's not yet over. There were other things going on. I talked longer than I intended to, and I'm standing here and you're sitting. So I'm happy to answer questions and talk with you all about your experience and thinking about these questions. Yeah.
Like Notes from the Comfort of the Young Old was basically about you, but have you done any research or any studies on that 60 to 80 age group to show where they fit into the scheme of things in the new world?
Yeah.
It's an aging population.
Yeah. The research actually which has grabbed me, there are two streams of research which have grabbed me. And it's not actually about the young old, it's about the next phase. So there's a research on what's called gerotranscendence, about older people who are withdrawing. You're smiling, so you must be familiar with this stuff. I've been fascinated by that. And I've been fascinated by the work of some German researchers on what they call senior cool, which is the ability to withdraw and be forgetful about self in order to withstand a whole bunch of terrible things which are happening to you and then come back and be fine. So I've been fascinated by that because I think that some of the qualities in those lives, and I won't use the word, some people use the word successful elderly, but I don't know what to make of that word. But elderly who seem to be managing and seem to be relatively satisfied with their lives, those same skills are the skills that caregivers use with young children. The ability to stay in the present moment, for example, like this research on old talks about their ability to withdraw from the moment, and also to remain in the present and not to be projecting the future. And specifically in the senior cool stuff, it talks about the ability to let things happen. And not to let one bad thing influence every other bad thing. To see,
People can be old at 60 and young at 80.
Yeah.
And that's something I think isn't really talked about very often. We talk about old, people getting old. One of my best friends is 98 on 12. I'm 78. I'm still working. I can't imagine not working. I love what I do.
Right. So I think, yes, and I think that's part of that's why I hesitated to say, okay, it's, young old 60 to 80, but you could be young old at, at any age.
I think we're aging differently
Yeah.
than our parents did.
Yes.
My mother died at 97, almost 90.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the labels are problematic.
Yeah, a big time problematic now.
Big time problematic. Although I have to say, what surprised me was the sense of relief I found. And I've invaded against this stuff. But what surprised me, honestly, was that I felt relief when I found this term, young old. Everybody who I've talked to about it, when I began to find it, hated the term. They found it awkward. They found it graceless. They found it, I belong to a writers group here in Toronto. They were horrified when I read the first piece that had young old. They said, that's a terrible language. I felt relief. I felt this helps me to stage my experience. Here I'd come through this decade with my parents, which was just horrific. So that's what old meant to me. And here was somebody saying, no, you can slow it down. You can slow the process down. You're not there yet. You're somewhere else. And I thought that was interesting. It surprised me that I had such a sense of relief that it made me feel okay. I can do this now. And yeah, there's some things which are just like they were and some things which aren't.
Have you got another word for retirement?
What?
Have you got another word?
Yeah, another word for retirement. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I've been retired for only 6 months. You stopped working 6 months ago. You're looking for something else to do now. Well, I feel pressured because people expect you to throw yourself into all sorts of things immediately. And I'm finding, I thought I was going to do that. I find my energy levels are crappy right now. I'm sort of going to that and I was at an event this morning where, they were celebrating my retirement, and of course I was being flooded by questions. Someone told me, oh, well, so-and-so's doing a double master's right now. What are you going to do? And it's like, oh, gee, I'd like to go back to university. That is intriguing, yes, but right now I'm just going to mad about movies. Various meetups and having fun, just frivolous fun.
Yeah.
Just entertaining myself.
Yeah.
But I do have that need, like probably a lot of other people, to reinvent myself. I just don't know what it is right
Yeah, I tell people you have to give yourself a couple of years here.
now. Yes.
You really have to give yourself a couple of years. And I think that you just sort of, you have to say that, it's going to take a couple of years to figure this out. I mean, in a way, I was lucky. My father always said I had, in quotes, a checkered career, so which was his way of saying I didn't live up to his expectations. But I mean, because I moved to Toronto and gave up my academic appointment earlier than I might have otherwise because of life circumstances. I had a chance to think about these issues sooner rather than later. And so it wasn't this, you're working and then you're not working. It evolved in a complicated way. And I feel thankful for that because I don't know what I would have done in your situation where this black and white shift. But one of the things that I wanted to communicate to peers is that the challenges are not unfamiliar to us. The challenges have often been buried by that busyness of midlife, and now they're resurfacing. So I think that it's not that they're new, it's just that we haven't been paying attention to them. And then at this time of life, they're resurfacing and we have to we're re-engaging with them. But we've done it before. And so, we can do it again and be successful at it. It's not all such a new world. That's the thing that I think seemed most important to me in trying to manage.
I think it's wise for people who are leaving work to treat it like you're looking for a new job and to look for what you want to do in that time. Because often people who don't plan ahead end up in an emotional crisis whereby they can be quite paralyzed by it. And they can end up with mental health issues as a result of not planning their life. It happened to a friend of mine who was a TV producer, and she wanted to work till she was 70. When she was 69, they said to her, sorry, but we don't let you go. It affected her so badly that she ended up 6 months in 12. She was so devastated. She said, I planned my life when I was 70, not at 60. So I think that when people are leaving work, it's the time that they should be looking for what are you going to do. I have a book out. You should buy my book, Single by Choice or Chance. Smart Woman's Guide to Living Longer Better. Susan has a copy to show you if you want. That's one of the things I talk about.
I wonder if any of you here are familiar with any research in this sort of young old stuff, this 60 to 80.
There's lots on we get older.
Yeah,
The
but
young old conceptualization, actually, I haven't really heard that much. The old is, I work in research, Chris and I teach undergrads and grad students. The old is very popular. You hear that a lot. There is a lot of discrepancy. What old is it 85 or is it 80? And I think the big challenge is, and this is the question I wanted to ask you, is at what point do you start to see yourself as old? Because in the research that we do, we say to people, well, you're retired or you left work, why don't you engage with the larger community or go to a senior center or whatever? I'm not a senior. I'm only 82.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to the senior center.
That's for people older than me.
That's for old people. Right? So I like the staging of it. I think that allows people a little bit more comfort to feel I'm not old yet. I'm young old. Old age is still coming. When you get to old age, you're like, I'm still not old. So it's, yeah.
I think also when people suggest you go to a senior center, I think this is another focus that we have to change.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, don't call them senior centers anymore. Rename them. Call them kind of a club or something that people could go. No, not even older adults. No. This is a social club that people want to go to because people don't want to go to older adult clubs. I don't. I won't.
you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction when you say old or not old. I think there's between the body being old, but the personality, the mind, the spirit, the sexuality, that doesn't get old. That doesn't get old. That's so it's the body, I think, that maybe people are associating with age with old. Because the other parts, the mind, it doesn't really get old. We're sort of distinguishing when they're not old because they're
They think that when
enthusiastic.
you're afraid you're old.
They're full of life inside, right?
There's an alignment difference, I think, because the way you think of yourself, you're like, oh, I don't feel my age.
Yeah.
Right.
But you may look your age, for example, from the outside world, and so there's a little bit of an alignment.
Right.
I was going to tell you also that with our undergraduate class this year was a 73-year-old student that we had. We've been encouraging to go on and do graduate school. And
I love it.
yeah.
My lawyer teaches at Cumberland, and she was told she couldn't continue to teach unless she got her master's, so she went back and got her master's.
Question with the body and the relationship between body and what you feel inside and what's going on in your head. It's really important.
Body,
I
mind, and spirit.
I looked at a little edit in a newspaper recently, but it's sparked by someone offering to give up their seats in the bus. And so it comes to coming to terms with that and saying, well, yeah, I'm going to do this. And that, that was okay. I think it's little things which build over time, and which you say, when do we identify or when do we see ourselves as a whole? I think it's little things like that which, build up over time.
I think there's a quick catch-up between how you feel and how you may look when that sort of thing happens. Because a similar thing happened, and I tell this to our students, that giving up your seat is actually ageist. Because you're assuming that this person does all these things. But I did it myself once. And I remember what the woman said. She said, this is the worst day of my life. I'm not kidding. She said, this is the worst day of my life. And because now I'm seen as one of those symbols on the wall there that requires assistance. Requires a seat. You can see, but nonetheless,
She talked about it.
she talked about it to me.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm really sorry that I didn't mean to do that. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I don't know.
I think age is a state of the mind. It's not to do with what you look like or how you feel or any of that. I think it's how, what are you thinking about? How do you feel about it from that point of view? So that's why I say sort of mind, body, and spirit. It's that spirit that you have.
I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, and I want to say two things. one of the things is that I appreciated the narrative for the talk today, that there weren't slides and then you were telling your story and you personalized that. And I really appreciated that. Really good, because we're used to something else, and I like that it was personal. I think the other thing I'll tell you is about retirement, and it's a quick story, but my neighbor retired when he was 70. And they had flamingos in the lawn and all that stuff to say happy retirement. And then I tell the story a lot too, because I saw him 2 weeks later sitting on his porch, unshaven, drinking alcohol in the middle of the morning, and I said, Paul, what's wrong here? And he said, I don't know what to do with my time. He's like, I wake up at 4 in the morning, I watch TV, everything is off cycle now. Because I used to get up at 7, I had a routine, I had people I socialized with, and all of that's gone. So how do I restructure that? You know, what I saw over the next few months was very interesting. Over the next few months, him and a lot of the other people on my street who were retired, all of a sudden start to structure their day around certain things. So every day now, he gets up at 6:30, he comes and has his breakfast in the garage or outside, and he doesn't go back inside unless it's lunchtime, and then 4 o'clock when the grandkids come. And this is sort of like what activity theory says, that people replicate whatever their life was structured and routine as in some way in retirement, and that allows them to cope better with all of this time that's unstructured, and what do you do with it? You get isolated and get down, and
Well, that's why they should start doing something while they're still working.
yes.
You know, I mean, people put their nose up at volunteerism, but you know, if people get involved in a volunteer that they like, they can fit it into their time.
Because otherwise it's a rough transition. So, anyways, that's all I want to
I
say,
can
but
relate
thanks.
to that, because right now it's been way too much time on Netflix.
Well, you can stay up and you can finish all 16 episodes tonight if you want.
Actually, I'm trying to, I've seen 38 chapters on those guys.
Absolutely. We're almost caught up.
Yep.
I have a certain point. We're seeing, I work in those drop-in centers.
Yes, I
And
That's an interesting drop-in center, okay.
but, well, they do think, and some people say, I'm not stimulated enough to do that when I'm not.
That's why something should be called pub.
So I'm wondering, maybe they need to be different activities now, other than
Bowling.
arts, crafts,
Oh, God, yes.
or we still have bingo. Some people still like those, we're dealing with generations that still like that, I guess, is that acquiring of free stuff. But maybe there needs to be like a sort of thing, you know, maybe there needs to be different activities at these. I don't know what they would look like or what we would do, but maybe it's a start of.
How about a current events? You take the 3 papers and you read the papers and you talk about them.
We're over. I'm happy to stay and talk.
Sure. I know some people have to go.
So we have another talk, but I just wanted to take an
Yeah, it was great. It really was.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that talk.
Thank you.
Thank you for email.
Okay, so here's my email. Someone has my email somewhere.
Actually, I'm on an email thread previously.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks, great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
all the
coming.
best in the young old stage.
Yeah.
We do Erickson stages there.
Yeah.
somehow, and like I guess the regenerative, the old, the latter stages, I guess, giving back and mentoring and all that. Maybe I guess it's still part of it.
Yeah. So Eric, did you say Erickson?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Erickson, he had 8 stages, and then he developed a 9th stage. Joan Erickson, his wife, who was also a psychoanalyst, in the later years, they developed a 9th stage based on their interviews with people in their 80s and 90s. And they began to rethink this stuff. It's a rather pessimistic stuff, I have to say. She said in the 9th stage, people review and go through all of the tensions of the earlier stages, but they often come out on the downside. So like with trust and mistrust, they end up on mistrust. They're mistrusting their bodies, they're mistrusting caregivers to care for them, and so on. But I mean, what was clear for me is, for example, my parents never reached the eighth stage of wisdom and reflection. They were caught up in, other stuff. Yeah, but they did rethink the end part. So I was glad for that.
Wow.
Good.
Seems like it's quite a journey for you with 3 in a row.
Yeah.
There.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
But here I am.
Yeah, you lived through it, so you're stronger for it. I'm taking this home.
And his name is Cocknell.
Retirement, your second title. It probably won't be too far off from the first part, because you have a part, because you have interest line area. So it might vary a little bit, that's something that you want to do, but never had a chance to do. Yeah. Branson has also courses, called for people.
I know, I'm so, they sound terrific.
Yes, we do. And it's very stimulating. It's
Yeah.
different areas too, like history and politics and science.
You could give a course like the University of Toronto, where they have a series of courses. You also give all the courses given by people who are retired, and they organize courses, they present a proposal, and it's accepted, and they lead courses. You want to take that on? I'm not taking that on.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that.
All right.
All the best, everyone. Okay, thank you.
Take care. I'll email you, I'll be there the first.
You always have coffee sometime.
Oh, thank you.
You're right.
Yeah, you go with these,
I was looking at the nice AG.
Are you still?
You got it.
Oh, sorry.
And I was thinking, they're on.
Agency, yeah, agency.
Where'd you go to Toronto?
From New York.
So, New York City.
Yeah.
I lived there in the 80s. That's why I lived there in the 80s.
Yeah. I lived on the east end of London.
Okay.
I started in New York and then between college.
Okay, the recipe for this.
Not
Then I
that
moved here, I didn't
proposing them
want
as
to,
No,
I didn't want to be teacher adults. I wasn't a natural, I was a natural with kids, but I wasn't a kid, I was not a natural with adults, I don't know. Actually, I was a natural with older adults.
Okay.
It was the,
Because you did the same kind of stuff.
it was just that, it was the ones, the undergraduates who were just out of undergraduate school, in the 20s to 30s, who were often trained to be teachers.
Right.
I mean, a couple great students, yes, but the majority, I didn't know how to reach them, and I saw that some of my colleagues did, and some of my colleagues were great at it, and had a kind of way of finding and enjoying the culture, but when I had a student in the class who was, say, returning to work, and she was in her maybe 30s or 40s,
Another story.
I was great. Because I appreciated
I
everything.
think you would have been terrific.
Yeah.
Really relate.
Yeah. So with these 40s, these returning to work women, I just thought they brought so much to the job. I thought they were so wonderful, and even in classroom discussions, they brought so much to these young women.
Well, they've had the experience.
Oh, yeah.
It's rich. It's great. Thank you.
Yeah, outlast the actual initial part of it.
Oh, I was just saying.
However, she and I have been friends.
We could